The clouds hung low over the Peruvian Andes, that morning heavy. Bruised and swollen with rain-wind, Jean Savoy stepped off the bus that would be the last piece of civilization he'd DC for weeks. It was 1964, and he was 37 years old, standing on a dirt road that seemed to dissolve into the jungle like a whispered warning. Locals passing by barely looked at him. They'd seen men like him before, wide-eyed foreigners, too curious for their own good, chasing ghosts and myths in the shapes of stones swallowed by vines. Most returned with nothing. Some didn't return at all. Savoy knew that. But he also knew something they didn't, that somewhere behind those ridgelines, hidden under centuries of moss and silence, lay the ruins of a forgotten Andean civilization one the world had once brushed up against, then promptly forgotten. He had come to find it, not for fame, not for money, but because an idea had bitten him years earlier and refused to let go. The story had started with a faded Spanish chronicle he found in an antique shop in Mexico, handwritten notes suggesting that the Incas were not the only advanced culture in the Andes, and that deep in the Vilcabamba region, past the last Inca strongholds, past where the conquistadors lost their nerve, there might be cities even older, possibly larger, untouched since before Columbus ever sailed west. Most scholars dismissed those accounts as fantasy, but Savoy wasn't a scholar. He was an outsider, an adventurer, and in many ways the perfect kind of reckless. Disciplined enough to stay alive, obsessive enough to go where others wouldn't, and stubborn enough to keep going even when everything told him to stop. As he stood there, breathing in the cold mountain air, he cinched his pack straps tighter, paid his guide, and began walking toward a wall of trees so thick it looked like an unbroken curtain. It was 10 a.m., and the jungle greeted him with a wet hush, like a cathedral swallowing sound. Every step forward felt like a step away from the world he knew: cars, streets, language, into a place ruled entirely by nature and the ghosts of people who once bent it to their will. The first days were deceptively calm. Forest canopies stretched overhead like a living roof, filtering the sunlight into shifting green patterns on the trail. Savoy followed faint paths cut by locals who used the jungle mainly for hunting, fishing, and rarely, very rarely traveling from one remote community to another. But after a while, even those paths disappeared. Soon he was hacking through vines with a machete, slipping on moss-covered stones, crossing rivers so cold they felt like molten ice against his skin. His guide, a quiet man named Mateo, moved like he'd been raised in the forest. Savoy tried to keep pace. The jungle had a way of wearing down men who didn't belong to it. After enough days, the silence between them grew heavy. At night, lying under a makeshift tarp, Savoy heard sounds that didn't seem to belong to any known animal. At dawn, he found enormous paw prints in the mud. Mateo said nothing. He didn't have to. By the second week, the rains came, and the expedition turned punishing. Water poured from the sky in thick, relentless sheets, soaking their gear, blurring the world into streaks of green and gray. But the rain couldn't hide everything. One afternoon, while crossing a steep slope overgrown with ferns, Savoy noticed something sharp and unnatural beneath the brush of stone block carved too perfectly to be natural. He dropped to his knees and brushed away the moss, revealing the corner of a wall. Mateo watched silently, his eyes unreadable. Savoy felt a jolt of electricity in his chest. It wasn't the city he saw it not yet, but it meant something monumental. People had lived here, people with the skill to move stone, to shape it. And where there was one stone, there were usually more. They pressed on. The deeper they went, the stranger the landscape became. Terraces appeared in impossible places and cliffsides, where no sane person would farm. Along ridges where the soil was too thin for crops. Savoy began mapping them carefully, sketches filling his journal with lines and grids and angles. But the terraces were empty. No buildings, no statues, no pottery fragments. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished, leaving behind only scars on the land. On the 17th day, while following a river upstream, the jungle suddenly opened around them. The canopy gave way to a clearing of broken stone, swallowed by thick roots. Savoy stopped, heart pounding. Before him stood a ruin small, weathered, half-collapsed but unmistakably ancient. The architecture didn't match Inca stonework. The blocks were larger, rougher, fitted like a puzzle whose logic modern eyes couldn't decode. Moss covered everything. Vines crawled over every surface. But the shape of it, The symmetry made his skin prickle. He walked among the stones slowly, reverently, as if waking someone from a centuries-long sleep. Matteo hung back, watching him with a mix of respect and fear. Savoy traced the stones with his fingertips, whispering to himself, trying to piece together fragments of history lost to time. But ruins this small didn't build themselves alone. They were outposts, extensions of something bigger. That night, the air grew heavy with tension. Matteo tended the fire without speaking. The flames cast shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long into the trees. At one point, he looked up and said quietly, "There are places the jungle protects. Places people are not meant to find." It was the most he'd said since they left the village. Savoy didn't answer, but he didn't sleep either. The next morning, Matteo refused to continue. He said he had taken Savoy as far as he could. Any farther, he said, would bring bad luck, or worse. Savoy tried to persuade him, but the man's mind was set, so they parted ways. Matteo returning the way they came, and Savoy pushing forward alone into a world where the trail ended and nothing but instinct remained. Traveling alone changed everything. The jungle no longer felt indifferent, it felt aware. The sounds grew louder, more aggressive. Trees creaked in the wind like old bones. Insects droned in relentless swarms. But with solitude came clarity. Savoy moved more quietly, more intentionally. His senses sharpened. He felt closer to whatever it was he was chasing. Call it a city, a kingdom, a civilization swallowed by time. On the 23rd day, at 4:12 p.m., Savoy climbed a ridge that looked no different from any other. The sun was low behind the mountains, casting the world in amber light. He pushed aside a curtain of vines and froze. Below him stretched an entire valley carved with terraces, walls, staircases disappearing into the undergrowth. The ruins spread across the landscape so wide it took him a full minute to comprehend what he was seeing. He whispered a single word, "Found." At first, it was overwhelming. Massive stone edifices loomed out of the forest like sleeping giants. Staircases rose toward the sky, swallowed halfway by centuries of decay. Storm clouds gathered above, but shafts of golden light pierced the darkness, illuminating patches of stone like spotlights on a forgotten stage. Savoy descended carefully, every step filled with disbelief. The architecture was unlike anything he had seen, a blend of geometric precision and primal strength, older than Inca, older than the empire that once ruled these valleys. He spent hours wandering, taking notes, sketching, climbing walls that crumbled under his weight. Everywhere he looked, there were hints of a society with knowledge, organization, ambition. This wasn't a small city, it was a metropolis, a rival to Machu Picchu, maybe even larger. He reached a plaza surrounded by towering structures, their facades etched with patterns barely visible through moss. In the center lay a massive carved stone, shaped like a ceremonial platform. He ran his hands along its edges, feeling grooves worn smooth by hands from another era. A sense of awe washed over him, not just for discovering the city, but for touching something built by people who had planned, dreamed, and lived here long before the world he knew existed. But then he noticed something strange. The city was vast, but it felt incomplete. No pottery, no tools, no bones, no remnants of daily life. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished overnight, leaving only monumental architecture behind. Civilizations don't disappear without a trace. But this one had. As night fell, Savoy made camp in what had once been a ceremonial courtyard. The sky cracked open with lightning. Thunder rolled across the valley like the roar of a forgotten god. Rain hammered the stone around him. Somewhere in the darkness, a tree fell with a violent crash. He sat under his tarp, shaking from cold and adrenaline, listening to the storm howl through the ruins. Lightning illuminated the valley in brief flashes each, one revealing massive structures hidden in the darkness. He had found something monumental, but the triumph came laced with fear, because now he wasn't just exploring ruins. He was trespassing in a place the jungle had kept secret for centuries. For the next several days, he mapped relentlessly. His journal filled with diagrams, measurements, sketches of walls, plazas, terraces, pathways. He moved through the city like an archaeologist possessed, leaving only to gather water or climb higher ground for better vantage points. He named the site Gran Pejiton, though local legends had whispered of it long before. The name felt inadequate for its scale. On the fifth morning, while surveying a series of walls higher up the slope, he found something that made his pulse surge. Carvings, not random etchings, but deliberate, sophisticated motifs, geometric patterns. Stylized figures, symbols that suggested stories or rituals. This was no minor culture. This was a civilization with its own language carved into stone. A civilization that had risen, thrived, and then been swallowed whole. He photographed everything, each click of the shutter echoing against stone like a gunshot. Months later, those photographs would stun the academic world. But in the moment alone, on a damp Andean mountainside, they were simply proof that he wasn't dreaming. But the city wasn't finished revealing itself. One afternoon, following a narrow ledge skirting a cliff, he slipped hand, his foot punched through a layer of brush, revealing darkness beneath, a void. Carefully, he widened the hole, pushing aside the wet earth until he saw stone stairs descending into a corridor, a hidden entrance, a secret path. Heart thundering in his chest, he descended. Inside, the air was cold, almost unnaturally so. He lit a small torch. The flame cast flickering orange light on the walls. Carvings lined the stone, more elaborate than anything outside. Figures of animals, celestial patterns, a serpent swallowing its tail. He felt the hair on his neck rise. This wasn't just architecture. This was meaning, myth, theology. The whispers of a people who had shaped their identity around symbols lost to history. He reached a chamber at the bottom of the stairs. It was circular, with a domed ceiling. In the center lay a stone basin filled with dry leaves and bones, animal bones, small, delicate. A ritual site, an altar. But then something else caught his eye, an inscription carved into the floor in a pattern that suggested both direction and caution. He knelt, tracing the symbols, trying to understand. The torch hissed softly as melted wax dripped onto stone. Was this room the heart of the city, or a warning left for those who entered? Before he could decide, a sound echoed through the chamber, a rumble, low and ominous. First he thought it was thunder, but then dust rained from the ceiling. The mountain groaned, the floor trembled. He bolted up the stairs as fast as he could, and he burst into daylight. The earth shook again. A rockslide thundered down a distant slope. Trees swayed violently. The city around him seemed to heave like a living thing awakening from sleep. He sprinted across the terrace, leaping over fallen branches, sliding on wet stone. When the tremors finally subsided, he collapsed to the ground, lungs burning, drenched in sweat and rain. For a long moment, he didn't move. It felt as if the city, this ancient, silent giant, had reminded him who was truly in control. Eventually, when his breath returned, he rose and looked around. The ruins were unchanged, eternal, but he felt different. The exhilaration had matured into something else: reverence, humility. Discovery had its price. He spent 2 more days documenting, photographing, and exploring, but with a new awareness. He was only a visitor. The city had survived centuries without him. It would stand long after he left. When he finally began the journey back, every step felt heavier. He left behind the valley with its terraces and stone giants, its secrets half exposed, half shrouded. But he carried with him proof that the Andean world was far larger and more complex than the narrative taught in classrooms. There had been another civilization organized, powerful, sophisticated, carving its legacy into mountains long before the Incas' rise to dominance. A culture overlooked by time, protected by the jungle, rediscovered only because one man was obsessive enough to chase whispers into the wilderness. Weeks later, when he returned to civilization, thin, exhausted, and sunburned, people stared at him as if he had come back from another planet. In a sense, he had. His photographs spread, his maps ignited debates. His discovery forced historians and archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Andes. But even then, even as newspapers hailed him as the man who uncovered forgotten kingdoms, Savoy knew the truth. He had found only a fraction of what still lay hidden. Over the years that followed, he would discover dozens more ruined cities swallowed by vines, fortresses perched on impossible cliffs, networks of terraces stretching across mountains. He would realize that the Andes held not one lost city, but many, fragments of a culture that once thrived across vast territory. Grand Pajeton was only the beginning. But the discovery that started it all, the moment when he pushed aside vines and saw a lost civilization sprawled before him like a frozen dream, never left him. Some nights, decades later, he would close his eyes and still feel the damp wind of that valley, still hear thunder rolling through the ruins, still see the glow of the setting sun illuminating stone carved by human hands 1,000 years before he was born. And somewhere in that memory, in that valley cocooned by forest and silence, the truth lingered like a whispered echo. History is not lost. It is waiting. Waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to seek it.